Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, before we go into this week's discussion, please do subscribe, won't you? I'm saying this every time, but it's paying off because we've had 5,000 subscribers in just 3 weeks. What you do is you press the subscribe button, and next door to that, there is a little blue bell. And if you press that too, then that's notifications. It means you get notified of every new program as it comes up. So please do that, won't you? And that would be great. Well, today on Counterculture, we're going to be discussing England, Englishness, and what happens to the Union. This is a very, very popular subject with our viewers, and it's one that we have covered a bit in the past. But we want to look really at what the future is really for this thing called England, politically and culturally. I'm very pleased that to discuss this today, we have Robin Tilbrook, who is the chairman and indeed the founder of the English Democrats, Emma Webb from Civitas, and Nigel Jones, who is a biographer, historian, and commentator. Can I start, first of all, by asking you, Robin, what is it that the English Democrats want?
So our primary campaigning position is that we want independence for England.
Yeah.
Obviously that necessarily means dissolution of the United Kingdom. We did campaign for about 15 years on the idea that we should have an English Parliament with a First Minister and government with at least the same powers as Scottish ones within a federal UK. But what we were finding was that basically the British establishment want to break England up, and their agenda is to break England into these sort of bogus regions that have no sort of historic meaning to them. So consequently the choice really becomes,
Yes.
Is England broken up or is the UK broken up? And obviously as English nationalists, English patriots, we're concerned to make sure that England remains its sort of historic unity.
Yes.
Of course, there are many other points that arise because England is actually quite unfairly treated in terms of the way the British state looks after it. We're the only part of the United Kingdom where the British government has direct rule over us. We've seen this very clearly with the whole coronavirus crisis, where the British Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, is the one issuing all the orders, whereas in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they've got their own governments and they're obviously focusing a bit more on the needs of their nation. We've just gone through the 1st of April, where every year in England the prescription charges go up, but in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland they're free. And there's now a lot more discussion about the fact that quite a lot of the money that's raised in England is actually spent in subsidising to an extra extent what happens in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And for instance, there was an article in the Telegraph only a couple of days ago pointing out that the spending in Scotland is 30% on average above what it is in England. And the reason for that is that English taxpayers, through the Barnett formula, are paying for it.
The Barnett formula, just in case people don't know, this is can you explain very briefly?
Yes. So back in the 70s, there was the first Secretary of the Treasury in the Labour government, and called Joel Barnett, and he invented, more or less on the back of a fag packet, literally, a formula whereby the Scots, in particular at that time, were going to get at least 10% extra out of the block grant, which is the way that the state allocates money. For subsidies, and the result of that, of course, is that you wind up getting at least 10% extra spent in Scotland for anything, and that includes, for instance, even capital projects. So money spent in London for the Crossrail project, or the proposal to spend a vast amount of money on building a railway up to Birmingham, Manchester, wherever it's going to go in the end. And even though the Scots may not have actually a project to spend it on, they still get a lump sum of billions, about 10%, handed to them as part of the Barnett consequentials.
Yes. Does that manifesto resonate with you, Nigel?
I have to say not particularly, because I think England as the most populous part of the United Kingdom has always had certain advantages. Perhaps now it's coming back to bite us, in that I think because we've been, as it were, the top dogs in the UK, I think we haven't thought very much about questions of English patriotism and English nationalism, or the fact that the Scots sort of get, if you like, a free ride on the English taxpayer, because we have had a certain, when I say we English, I'm half Welsh, so maybe we'll come on to discuss how this affects people who are a bit of both, who are half Welsh, half Scottish, half Irish, whatever. But I think that England did have an inbuilt sense of superiority, and that was, I think, tied up with the empire. And I think when the empire dissolved in the 40s, 50s, 60s, England was left a bit bereft because the British Empire had gone. And what was Britain? That was the question. And I think it was Dean Acheson, the American diplomat and politicians, said England has lost an empire, Britain has lost an empire. There I am, you see, I'm using the two things interchangeably. Britain has lost an empire, has not found a role. And then our ill-fated attempt to link ourselves with Europe and the EU, which has occupied us for the last 40, 50 years. Now that we're out of the EU and unlikely to go back, I think that the question of England is a big one, is arising, especially as I see Scottish nationalism, and to a certain extent Welsh nationalism, largely composed of anti-Englishness.
Yes, I'd just like to say, I totally agree with Nigel about the role of empire in the creation of the United Kingdom. I mean, that's what it was all about. I mean, the United Kingdom wasn't created because ordinary people wanted a United Kingdom. The ordinary Scots, ordinary English, did not want the Act of Union. In fact, the Scots, I think, marked that rather clearly by making the place where the Act of Union agreement was signed into a public toilet in Edinburgh.
Really?
Yes, so I'm told. But the point is, in 1707, we were, England and Scotland, for that matter, were at war under one crown, Queen Anne, with Louis XIV. And of course, the Act of Union with Ireland, 1801, we were at war with Napoleon Bonaparte. And so in both cases, those Acts of Union were about empire and about world power and realpolitik, as it were, rather than about what ordinary people wanted. And I think we've got an opportunity now, as all of that's gone, to focus more on what people want rather than on imperial politics and power.
I think that's an interesting point, actually, that the leaving the EU it'll take a while perhaps, but it's actually going to highlight all of these issues. I mean, we've been preoccupied with this pandemic and everything, haven't we? But this is going to come to the fore. I mean, would you call yourself British or English? English. Yeah. Is that sort of a conscious thing?
I don't think so, but because I would regard myself as probably more of a unionist, and perhaps politically unionist, but culturally English, and so I think there are benefits to the union, and that's one reason why, at least at this point in time, I'm inclined towards the arguments to try, sort of almost with any means, to try and keep it held together for political reasons. But culturally, I think there is a very good point there that, as you mentioned, that Scottish and Welsh nationalism, as with many other ideologies that we're constantly being bombarded with, are distinctively anti-English, and we've suffered in many ways from the fact that the benefits of us being so culturally and politically influential from the empire and within the union, that we have an almost blindness towards English culture and English issues, and I think probably the interplay between the cultural concern there and the political is what will turn out to be important. And I don't think that, although their intention, I don't think that necessarily I think that you can strike a balance there in the way that I do personally as a unionist who identifies as being English, and I think perhaps one solution is to try to find ways to bolster people's national identity in a healthy way within different parts of the union, without necessarily having to make the argument for breaking the union apart. Finding a way to make it a little bit less dysfunctional and see if the marriage can be made to work.
Well, the thing is this is the problem, isn't it? Because Scottish and Welsh nationalism was always seen as kind of like cool and essentially progressive. This word progressive, i.e. left-wing, right? Left-wing. English nationalism is seen as somehow thuggish, automatically, and somehow fascist, yes, and certainly nationalist.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's either skinheads or Morris dancers.
I don't know.
But I was going to say, in response to what Emma was saying, that actually the British state, as it's working at the moment, is quite focused on trying to sort of clamp down on any idea of Englishness. The whole way in which sort of political correctness agenda is working is basically to say that you're not allowed to say you're English, and if you do try and say you're English, then all sorts of inquiries should be made into why you're saying that, and perhaps along the lines of what you're saying. But that is completely untrue of Scottish or Welsh or Irish nationalism. Funnily enough, I mean, if you think about Irish nationalism, which has involved plenty of violence over the years, that's okay. But English nationalism, which hasn't involved that violence, somehow that's not okay.
Yeah, I think the problem is, as I was saying, that England is very much the dominant partner in the union, and I think whenever you get a minority, particularly a strong minority, who resent the domination, I mean, God hope this will never happen to England, but let's take the example of former Yugoslavia, where the Croats were a substantial minority vis-à-vis the Serbs, who were the major force, and the Bosnian Muslims were an even smaller minority, and the Slovenians were even smaller than that. And I think they always resented the dominance of the major group, the major majority population. The capital was in Serbia, Belgrade. Similarly, I think that there's resentment among the Scots, the Irish and the Welsh of the dominance of this, the fact that our parliament, the only parliament before devolution, is centred here in London, a few yards away from here in Westminster. I think that is a major force behind this resentment. And any display of English nationalism, the St George's flag that you're wearing in your lapel, provokes either contempt, i.e. Emily Thornberry sneeringly tweeting the picture of the St George's flag. I've just been spending Easter in a seaside town in Sussex called Selsey, which is a sort of microcosm of English nationalism. And there are lots and lots of Union flags. There are also lots and lots of St George's flags there. So I do think that English nationalism is a sleeping giant which has been prodded into life by the nationalism of the smaller components of the UK.
But can I just, before we go on to discuss, I just wanted one thing. You're talking about the dominance of England when it came to the empire and such like. Hang on, the Scots, their role, was it phenomenal in the empire?
Absolutely,
wasn't it? I mean, they seem to have really forgotten. And also they even wanted to start their own empire, didn't they? Famously, before the kind of British Empire. There was this sort of attempt, wasn't there, in South America or something?
The Darien scheme in Central. That's what caused the Act of Union, because they were bankrupt because of the failure of the Darien scheme.
So what is all this like, let's all blame the English thing? I mean, it's the Scots were very much there, weren't they?
They were.
We do have an odd situation, though, with Celtic nationalism, because both, the SNP, Clyde Cymru, and also Sinn Féin, they've all become basically Marxist or, at any rate, far left. They're not nationalists. They're sort of trading on nationalism. And in fact, in the run-up to the last general election, I noticed that Nicola Sturgeon said that she wanted to see Scotland to be an independent, internationalist country within the EU, which sounded to me completely cuckoo. But that's
Good
what
luck
she
with
said.
that. Yes. Good luck with that. How would you, Robin? How would you define? Therefore, we've talked about. You just mentioned English culture there. How would you define English culture if you had to? Because one of the questions that we always find ourselves talking about here is basically, that the left will quite sneeringly say, well, what is British culture anyway? They say things like that, when you're talking about British values, British culture. What is it anyway? What do you think is distinct about English culture?
Well, can I, as a lawyer, therefore, interested in how this works out in court?
We're fine with lawyers on this show, don't worry.
Because the Labour inspired, as it were, and written Equality Act has actually offers a sort of definition, a multi-layered definition. So a national identity like English can be a national identity, which is to a large extent about where you feel you belong. So to answer Nigel's point, he can be English and Welsh and feel strongly about being English, which would make him by national identity English. There's also been court cases, in fact, funnily enough, involving the BBC, where English was defined as being a racial group, and there's also English as an ethnicity, because ethnicity has been defined by the courts as being a sort of subset of things. So English is the subset of British, and therefore is an ethnicity. But then you got sort of cultural origin, which I think is what you were referring to, and cultural origin. Obviously, it's what people associate with being English as much as anything. You don't really get. I don't think any nation gets a sort of definition of what it is to be of that nation. But of course, people recognise it and they know what's meant by it. Some people on the left, of course, are trying to sort of deconstruct the whole idea of nation. For instance, I saw one of the squad before the American presidential election saying that it wasn't just Trump's wall that was racist, but the very idea of borders was racist. Obviously, such people they are going to come up with purely instrumental points to try and delegitimize what they regard as a hostile thing, which is the very idea of nation.
Yes.
But for those of us that actually care about our nation, we don't really need a definition about it. It's in our hearts. We love our country. We want to see it do well.
I find actually a bit like I find that I call myself English now, and I mean one thing I found quite interesting is that my parents, bless them, when they were always British, and they talked about Britain, and then there's just kind of was imperceptible over a period of time they started calling themselves English, and I think it's because there was this feeling that somehow something was being lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. With any nation, not just the English, it is something that comes out of attachments. It's something that grows up organically. It's why when Orwell, he gave what could sort of his closest definition to Englishness was just a set of impressions, things like the nun riding her bike along the cobblestones and things like that. It's things that you're attached to, and it plays into everything, like the common law, our institutions, things that can't be man-made by one generation but just accumulate over many, and therefore are particularly precious, and people have an inexplicable attachment to them that can't possibly be explained. It's not something that can be pinned down in a definition. It's a reason why, firstly, it's so difficult to protect, and also why it's so vulnerable against ideologies like we're currently seeing with some of these sort of postmodernist, deconstructionist, Marxist ideas that want to tear down all of our institutions because they say that they're systemically racist, or they're systemically misogynist, or they're systemically something evil. And I think that is one of the reasons why, along with other things like a sense of loss of place, the transience of communities because of globalization and mass immigration, people feel this sense of loss that it creates a need to identify yourself as English in a way that you wouldn't have felt before. But again, it's not, as we discussed in a previous counterculture, it's not because of a sort of xenophobia to anything outside or to the threats, but a response to the affection towards the things that you love in the same way that you would love your own family or your own children or your own home.
I think there is this thing, is there not, Nigel, that you're correct, the left tend to portray it as being a kind of an aggressive thing. But in fact, often it's just like people wanting familiarity. There's a sense in which people now are told, and this is certainly London telling the country, that familiarity is wrong, that it's provincial, that it's small-minded. And it's always applied to the English, is it not?
It is. And the danger of that, of course, is that the English are then going to feel threatened and going to react by perhaps conforming to the stereotypes that has been put on them. Alternatively, they could ask themselves, as Emma said, what do we mean by English, by being English? What are the associations that we have? And I don't think that whatever the court said about race and ethnicity, I don't think Englishness is a question of race. For example, David Lammy, the very left-wing black Labour MP for North London, got very aerated with the caller who said, well, you're not English. And he said, well, actually, I am. I was born in England, brought up, I identify as English, as a black Englishman. And I think he was right. I mean, I don't often agree with David Lammy, but I think he was absolutely right to make that point. And what do I think of? I think it's places, it's culture. It can range from anything from cricket to roast beef to Morris men, as you say. Not that that's a particular thing, but it's a whole range. It's Peter Cook, it's Ray Vaughan Williams's music. It's an absolute medley of impressions, memories, words.
A country, in other words.
A country.
It's
and
also
a culture.
local nationalism as well. People are, in the same way that they are in Scotland or in France, people are particularly, they identify and feel affection towards particular areas, particular towns, particular regions, the landscape. I mean, the pastoral scenes are something that's very associated with Englishness. And I think that English, I'm not going to say nationalism, but I think English patriotism is much more associated firstly with country than nation, which is a distinction that Roger Scruton also makes, but is almost an inherent disadvantage, because Scottish nationalism and Irish nationalism particularly, and maybe to some extent just the Celtic nationalisms, they have a sort of revolutionary fervour to them, whereas English nationalism or patriotism seems to be somehow more inherently conservative. It's not because it hasn't needed to, because of the power dynamics. It hasn't needed to assert itself in a kind of revolutionary way, because it wasn't the counterculture, and so it doesn't have any of the sort of like fashionable thrill that you get with being part of a kind of revolutionary counterculture.
I think one of the key things about English patriotism or nationalism is it's very old. If you think Germany was united in 1871, Italy 1863, England was united in 927. On the 12th of July 927, for those that want the date, at the Council of Emont, up near Penrith, under King Athelstan. And so actually, we see the world, I think English people at any rate do, see the world through the idea and prism of nationhood. Whereas if you were German, for example, that's much more
or Italian even.
Arguable. Or Italian, yes. I mean, in Italy, they've still got some of the laws that were passed during Mussolini's time requiring school kids to speak of all the Italian languages, to speak only Italian in school, because they were trying to create a sense of nation from something that had been previously, right back to classical times, had been separated into different nations or different states at any rate. And had different languages. So Venetian wasn't the same as Milanese. And those languages still exist and are still spoken by people living in those areas. But Italian is a sort of project to try and create a united Italy and a sense of Italianness. Whereas that isn't true of of Englishness. Englishness is much older, and it never really was sort of divided in the way that we get with most of the European states. If you go back 100 years or so, I'm reading a book about the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the moment. And the curious thing there is that actually the empire itself more or less created the nations.
Yes.
By insisting upon people being taught in their own local languages rather than having an overarching language. But English, has been the language that everybody has spoken in England for many, many centuries. Well before Shakespeare, and no doubt even before Chaucer. But our unity is something that we just simply assume. Could I come back on one other thing that Emma was saying about Britishness? Because obviously I've spoken to a lot of British politicians over the years, and one of the things I find quite interesting is that they never come up with any argument for the Union apart from it enables us to punch above our weight on the world stage. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to get involved in punching any sort of weight on the world stage, if at all possible. I'd rather have a state where we were less ambitious to be punching our weight on the world stage.
I think it's interesting that Little Englander is always used as a sneering political insult. Well, I don't really see anything wrong with being a Little Englander. I remember David Cameron said at one point, well, we don't want to become like Switzerland, as though Switzerland was a horrible little thing on the bottom of his shoe, whereas Switzerland is an example of a multi-ethnic, certainly multilingual society that has maintained independence without going to war with anyone, proudly, sturdily. I think Switzerland is pretty good. It's terribly dull.
It's kind of boring.
It's boring, but it's
kind of boring. Chocolate and clocks.
Okay. I'm not trying to make a case for Swiss nationalism.
Well, you were actually not.
But it's not. But at least it's not revolutionary.
No, it's not revolutionary. What about this? There is this very inchoate, but nevertheless very strong feeling about which I subscribe to, which is that I like the United Kingdom. But frankly, if we are so hated and if they want to get us so much, then fine by me. Just go off, as an Englishman,
I'm not sure that we should buy the SNP's narrative as being representative of the feelings of the Scottish people, though. I don't know how representative they actually are. They didn't actually win when they put it to the vote. And I think, like you were saying, most people, even though I identify as English and I've got Welsh heritage, I might have a little bit of Scottish in there, most people have a mix. And the same is true in Scotland, and the lowlands are very different politically from the highlands, and the cities are very different from the rural areas. And so, I think it's important not to buy into the SNP's narrative and to bolster them by responding as if they are actually representing the feelings of the Scottish people, because I think it's so much more complicated than that.
Well, I noticed an interesting opinion poll after the referendum in Scotland, which was saying that in fact the majority of ethnic Scots had actually voted for independence. What tripped them back into getting a no result was actually English immigrants into Scotland, of whom there are nearly 1 million. And over 80% of those voted no. So that was, I thought, an interesting insight into what had gone on there.
I tend to agree with what Peter said, that let's compare it to an unhappy marriage. If one partner can't stand it and wants to get away and wants to break away, and I agree with Emma, we shouldn't necessarily assume that the majority of Scots do buy into this SNP narrative, but if they do, or if they in 5 years, 10 years time do, I think most English people would say go. I don't think there would be a great battle, it's sad to say in some ways, to save the Union. I think in that sense Britishness has weakened over the last 50 years.
The British state has actually been in effect trying to bribe Scots to vote to keep the Union. That's what the Barnett Formula is partly about. And it was actually expressly about at the time. It was about trying to undermine the appeal of Scottish nationalism.
If I could just say that the one thing, or one of the things that seems to be keeping the whole thing together actually is the monarchy, is the institution of monarchy in a way. Now, if Scotland got independence, or if English got independence, would we just have an English monarchy? Would it actually go back to being, possibly, with Elizabeth II? Elizabeth I was the last purely English queen, wasn't she?
Yes.
She was. And of course, the Act of Union in 1707 did actually create, and it says so, United Kingdom of Great Britain. Yeah. So for Scotland to go, that's got to be repealed. Yeah. And the two political constitutional entities that were brought together in the Act of Union was the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland. That's what the Act of Union was about. Yeah. As far as the Welsh concerned, Wales had been incorporated into the Kingdom of England in 1536 under the Tudors. But of course, if you repeal the Act of Union, then you have the crown, the king or queen of England. But I don't think it necessarily has an impact on the monarchy beyond that, because if you think about it, after all, the Queen is also the Queen of Canada. She's the Queen of Australia.
Yes, but the interesting thing is that this might seem like a small point, but I mean, the time being as it is, the Queen is not going to be here for many, many, many years. You could have a situation where Scotland says, actually, that's fine. Now, with her going, we do not want King Charles III, or as he would be, Charles II, wouldn't he be in Scotland, I think?
Yes.
That could actually be a major symbolic thing, could it not? I mean, it's breaking a tie. It's breaking one of the things that keeps the union together. Yeah?
Yeah, I think there will be questions when the present Queen goes, and maybe this is why Prince Charles likes to wear a kilt so often, so frequently, and or maybe he likes cross-dressing anyway. But I think the monarchy is a symbol of union, and it was significant. One of the diplomatic lapses that David Cameron made when he relayed the result of the Scottish independence referendum to the Queen. He said she purred with delight, or words to that effect.
Forgotten.
And that won't be forgotten, absolutely.
No.
No.
We still don't have a public holiday for St George's Day, do we?
No.
This must be one of your lesser demands in your...
Yes, we do say there should be a public holiday for St George's Day.
It is extraordinary, isn't it, though, that we don't have a public holiday?
We don't have any public holiday specifically about England or the English, unlike the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, who have separate holidays. Yeah. And England, of course, has, curiously, 3 saints. We have St George for England, we have St Edmund for the English, and we have St Edward the Confessor for the English monarchy. So you could have any one of 3 saints' days, or in fact you could have a secular date, which would be the date of our unification, 12th of July.
Yes.
Although some Ulstermen might argue about that date.
Can you think of, just to finish off, I mean, I glory in being an Englishman, actually. I mean, I love even saying it. I love saying I'm an Englishman, I do. In Gilbert and Sullivan's, despite all temptation, he remains an Englishman. But is there something you can feel that is tokenistically or in essence English for us to finish the programme, with St George's Day just around the corner? What would you say is an English thing that you could do, or a feeling you have? Oh, that's actually very English. For me, it's humour, without question. It's sort of humour.
Yes, we have an unusual sense of humour, I think, English.
And pragmatism.
We are pragmatic as well, and I think the sheer length of our history makes us not so revolutionary, as you're saying, much more sort of able to take a long view on things.
Cool-headed.
Yeah.
I think the English language.
English language.
And associated with it, arguably the greatest literature, the greatest writer in the world, and it's a language which has travelled everywhere. It's now the universal language, so that would be my
English
symbol of
language.
Englishness.
Yes.
For me, it's the landscape.
The
Yeah.
landscape.
So I think there are some places particularly that have that ancient feeling to them, and I think most people would be pretty hard pressed to go to those places and to not feel places like Lindisfarne. Even to some extent, I feel the same way about Scotland. So maybe it's not perfectly
That's another
distinctively
programme,
English.
I think, Emma.
But I think there's something about the way that places in Suffolk and there are some places that just feel distinctively English and pastoral, and they have that deep sort of ancient wild feeling alongside the kind of gentle pastoral nature that seems to sort of fit the English character.
And sometimes even the English landscape is summed up in a piece of music, like Vaughan Williams's Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis.
it's heartbreaking.
Whenever I hear that, I think of English hillsides. English.
I remember going to, when I was on holiday in the Malvern Hills once, went to the top there, it's very corny, but played the Enigma variations, but it was very much of a time. I mean, the fact is, to finish it, how easy it was for us to come up with those things. Humour, landscape and language. It took no time at all, did it?
No.
So that shows the strength of something, I think. Anyway, on that note, thank you very, very much, Robin. Thank you, Nigel and Emma. And we'll see you next time, but also celebrate St. George's Day when it comes. And we certainly will be. Okay, so see you next time.